What's going on? Welcome back to another episode of the Fitness Business Life podcast. If you are new here, you are very welcome to the show. If you've been on here and you have listened before, welcome back once again and thank you for tuning in. As always, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and if you get value from the content here, please do share this with a friend who you know would get value from it as well. That is all I ask in return. Anyways, I'm flying solo here tonight. No guests this evening. And there's something that I kind of wanted to break down. So, like I said, if you are a new listener, here's what you can expect from this podcast. Pretty much a wide variety of topics. It's the Fitness Business Life podcast. And purely because I just like to talk about those three things. I like to talk about fitness, I like to talk about business, and I just like to talk about my philosophy around life. And I like to hear other people's viewpoints on those as well. And so on this evening's episode, what I'm going to talk about is periodization and how that relates to business as well. So if you're not familiar with the term periodization, um, basically the concept was developed in Eastern Europe. And so it's related to athletic events, right? And how this kind of came about, for anyone that's not maybe familiar with the history of programming and periodization. So what would have happened was, well, you've basically got there's so many cycles, as in like if you're talking an athletic event, well, you've got individual training sessions, and then you've got what's called a microcycle, which is anywhere between 3 to 4 week blocks. Then you've got a macro cycle, which is usually 12-week blocks. And then you've got a mesocycle, which is usually 4 12-week blocks, which makes up your annual training cycle, a year. And then after that, you've got what's called a quadrennial cycle. And quadrennial cycles were basically developed for the Olympic Games. So what would have happened was athletes would have, not athletes, maybe their coaches would have looked at the numbers that they wanted to hit at the Olympic Games or whichever competitive event that was coming up every 4 years, be it, the Winter Olympics, which is a later iteration of it. But it was originally developed for the Olympic Games or the World Championships, depending on the sport. And so the coaches would have looked at the numbers that they hypothetically believed would have had their athlete win the Olympic Games, and then they would have worked back from there, and then that would have made up the bulk of their training. Because what is the pinnacle of sport? It's the Olympic Games, and every high level athlete wants to win a medal there, and especially with lifting sports or track and field sports, which was very numbers orientated. And so, yeah, you would have the coaches would have basically ran the numbers based on what they would have wanted their students hitting at the Olympics. And so the concept of periodization was developed. And, truth be told, it was developed in Eastern Europe, and then it was kind of picked up in sort of Western society and, quite frankly, bastardized a little bit. And so, it's come to be what it is today and how people sort of know it. And I would have, back in the day whenever I was coaching on the gym floor, I would have looked at, a lot of real old school coaches and how they approached programming. And it was all very skill based as well. But that aside, conceptually, what you've got is those things. I mean, that's what you've got. And then within the block of time dedicated to training, there's basically four variables that you have to manage, which is volume, intensity, density, and frequency, right? And, as a general rule of thumb, if volume goes up, intensity usually comes down, and vice versa, right? And then you've got density and frequency. And so density is just basically the amount of work that can be done within a given time frame. And then frequency is the amount of exposures to a certain stimulus within a microcycle. And so what that means is, what all of these basically mean is volume is sets by reps by load. Intensity is a percentage of a one rep max or percentage of a max heart rate. Density, as I aforementioned, which is the amount of work done within a given time frame. And then frequency is the amount of exposures within a given microcycle, as in like how many days a week you're training. So for example, if I let's say I take just a standard lift, let's say bench press, and just to keep it, you know, let's say bog standard, let's say we've got an individual who is bench pressing 50 kilos and they're doing 5 sets of five, 2 days a week with 2.5 minutes recovery in between each set. And yeah, that's it, right? So there's a few things that we could do there to basically manipulate the variables of this person's training program. We could go 2 minutes 15 recovery on the sets. So that would basically be an increase in density. We could, if they're training 2 days a week, we could have them do that 3 days a week. And both of those things would be progressive overload. Uh, Instead of doing 5 sets of five, we could maybe have this person do 5 sets of six, or on the off chance, let's say that's too much, maybe just one rep extra, depending on the intensity that this person is working at. It could be 4 sets of five and 1 set of six, and then each time they're exposed to the training stimulus, it could then be 3 sets of five, 2 sets of six, and then we would go 2 sets of five, 3 sets of six, 1 set of five, 4 sets of six, 5 sets of six, if that makes sense. And so then the intensity would basically mean that this person, everything else remains the same. And instead of, so they're doing 2.5 minutes recovery time, they're training twice a week, they're doing 5 sets of five, except the following week, we increase the intensity to 52.5 kilos, right? So that, in a kind of nutshell, as a really, really brief overview, is periodization, right? It's progressive overload. So we've got the given time frame that we are going to basically train this certain pattern or this certain stimulus, be it squat, bench, deadlift, calisthenics, kettlebells, like whatever it is whatever the stimulus it is that you're training, there has to be some sort of specificity there, as in like said principle, meaning specific adaptation to impose demands. And then you choose the given time frame that you are going to train said stimulus, and then you basically manipulate the variables from there, right? Assuming that you want to get better at the thing, then that's the four variables that you're basically working with, okay? So here's how this relates to business. Within those, so you've basically got like a number of ways to progressively overload someone. And I kind of did mention that volume, intensity, density, and frequency were the variables. And then it's a case of, okay, so how do I want to use those variables? And there's a few ways that you can do that. You've got traditional sort of linear and non-linear ways to progressively overload someone's lifts. For example, you might just add weight to the bar every single week. And if that's the case, then the volume is going to come down. A straightforward, simple approach to doing that would be, let's say you pick any lift and you go 6 sets of 6 for 6 weeks, and each week you add weight to the bar. Then you go 4 sets of 4 for 4 weeks, and each week you add weight to the bar. And then you go 2 sets of 2 for 2 weeks, and each week you add weight to the bar. So every single week you're adding weight to the bar, except after week 6, the volume comes down. And then after week 10, the volume comes down again. And so that is a really, really typical linear style training cycle. Then you've got what's called a non-linear or a wave cycle, which would basically mean that within every little sort of micro cycle, you might peak at week 3. So say you increase the intensity for 3 weeks, and then what would happen is you would kind of back off for a week, otherwise known as a little bit of a deload. So for example, on week 1, pick whatever lift it is. Week 1, it is you're squatting 80 kilos for 5 sets of 5. Week 2, you're squatting 82 and a half for 5 sets of 5. Week 3, you're squatting 85 kilos for 5 sets of 5. But then what would basically happen is week 4, you might back off and you go back down to 82.5. And then what would happen is you work back up. So you go up 3, back 1, up 3, back 1, up 3, back 1, right? So that is a sort of non-linear style training cycle. And then there's one more, which is my own personal preference, and this one is really related to business. It's called a step cycle. And how a step cycle works is you basically go by RPE, which is rate of perceived exertion, for anyone that's not familiar. And so what would generally happen is you would expose yourself to a certain stimulus. So again, let's say you take a bench press and you start with a weight that feels like maybe a 7 or an 8 out of 10 in terms of RPE. And you run your training cycle, basically lifting exactly the same every single day, until what would eventually happen is that the RPE would decrease on that lift. So for example, if I have someone who starts off with 5 sets of 5 on the bench press at 50 kilos, and I have them do exactly the same volume, intensity, density, and frequency. So I make get them to go 5 sets of 5 on the bench with 2 minutes recovery, and I have them do that 3 days a week. And so I keep them doing that for 4 weeks, right? What's going to happen is that the RPE on that lift comes down. And the reason for that is because it's specific adaptation, right? A story that I would have kind of told my students quite often around this was that, so back in the day, I'm actually pretty sure someone told me that this still exists on the building sites, but what would have happened back in the day, and I remember this from my days of working in the pub, was that you would have had a HUD carrier, right, on a building site. And these dudes were, they weren't in the best of shape, truth be told. They never were, because they were just basically, as we would call it in Belfast, gargle merchants, right? So they just loved the drink, right? And so you would have seen these guys on the building sites, and they would have carried like 50 brick on a HUD, right? And they used to have like competitions and stuff on this, and they were built for purpose, okay? And so if you had got someone fresh off the street and asked them to do this, they wouldn't have been able to do it, right? Or if you had got one of these guys and asked them to do anything else other than carry a HUD, they wouldn't have been able to do it. but they were usually, these dudes were like strong as an ox, but they weren't very big and they weren't very jacked or anything like that. Quite often they would be, and sometimes they would be like the smallest guy on the building site, right? But they were just so strong and they were fit for purpose, as I say. And so, what would have happened with these guys is that their work hours were always the same. So that maybe they started work at like 8 a.m. in the morning, and then they would have worked until lunchtime. They would have ate the same every single day. They would have carried the same amount of bricks on the hood. And so nothing changed. So there was no real progressive overload. And the human body is an adaptation machine. And so then, to someone who doesn't do that job, that's a lot of work. But to these guys, adaptation occurred, and to them, it was no problem. And so, uh, like I said, because there was no change in stimulus, they would have basically just remained the same throughout their entire HUD carrying career. And so, all this to say that the reason these guys didn't get any bigger or didn't put on much more mass or muscle tissue or anything like that was because they were so well adapted to the work that they were doing. So, in order for change to occur, what would have happened or what would have had to happen over time was that as the RPE decreased on their effort, then they would have had to maybe add more bricks to their HUD, which they would never do because at the end of the day, they weren't there for a workout, they were there for a day's work. And or they maybe would have had to do more runs each day, or something would have had to change. They would have had to eat more food at lunch. Something would have had to change in order for adaptation to occur, but it never did. So these guys generally stayed the same and they stayed fit for purpose. So whenever you are training step cycles, essentially what you do is you start off by exposing yourself to a certain stimulus and you remain at that volume, intensity, density, and frequency for a while. Once the RPE decreases through whichever, uh, all those variables stay the same. And once the RPE decreases, then what you do is you manipulate one of those variables and then the RPE will increase again. So, for example, you take a 50 kilo bench press 3 days a week, 2 minutes recovery, 5 sets of 5, and you have the person work at that until the RPE comes down to like a 5, because it will do eventually. And then what you do is you say, okay, well, now they're going to do 5 sets of 6, which would drive the RPE up. And then this step occurs again. Now, when I when I think about all of this, I tend to think about business in exactly the same way. So I tend to think about business as a step cycle. And I'll explain my thought process with this, right? So, and again, I can only share from my own experiences. Um, so I started off my entrepreneurial career and it was relatively comfortable. I want to say that relatively. At the time, it felt like my world could end because I had a job for life with my father. I was working in his pub, and I had, there was just generally I could do what I want. Essentially, I left school and I could do what I want. I was in a leadership role very early. There was no major pressure on me to do any kind of like major work. I kind of I had it easy, truth be told, probably too easy. And so then what happened was I decided that I didn't want to work in a pub for the rest of my days. I felt like I had more in me. I felt like I had more to give. And so then I made the decision to open a gym. And uh, I done that. But I knew fitness was what I wanted to do, and so I started doing that. Now, the problem was that I was hiring a space from my father, right? And well, it was a pro and it was a con. Um, and it was actually above his pub. And for anyone that doesn't know the story, it was a complete shambles. Like my friends actually built the kit in our first sort of little PT studio, and it was three flights of stairs above a public bar where our members had to walk through a restaurant and through a public bar to get up into the facility, and it was just a mess, but it was good fun, truth be told. But what basically happened was we were going to get shut down because we actually didn't have planning permission for this. In fact, I didn't even know what planning permission was back in the day. And so planning actually walked in one day and I was training a few clients, and I didn't know who they were, and they come over and they were like, "Hey, what's going on? Is this like a business?" And truth be told, it wasn't really a fully fledged business. It was just kind of me and my business partner winging it back in the day. And uh, they actually walked over to one of our clients and asked them, did they pay to be here? And fortunately, the client was quick enough to say, "Nah, I'm just in doing a bit of a training session." But listen, it didn't work. They knew what was going on, and so they said, "Look, you've got X amount of time to get planning permission for this, or it's getting shut down." Right now, that felt like the end of the world to me. That felt like my world was about to just collapse in on itself because I had quit my job and went all in on this fitness thing. And looking back on it now, I mean, I could have just went back to doing what I was doing and reset, recalibrated, and started all over again. But I didn't want to do that. I actually had my son was on the way as well. So, Katrina and I had just found out we were expecting our firstborn Oliver. And so, there was also that was in the back of my mind as well. So I set about trying to then get planning permission, which was a complete joke. But eventually, and I want to say like a few days before we moved out of that first facility, we did get planning permission, but I had already had plans in place to expand into a new location, which another year and a bit down the line, I got an eviction notice to move out of our second location, right? Which was due to be demolished a few months later. And so had I not had the experience in the first location of, going through and dealing with all of the uncertainty that I had dealt with in the first location, that second location would have freaked me out way more than what it did do. Like I was quite calm in dealing with the clusterfuck, pardon the term, of business that we had gotten ourselves into in location two. So I was able to deal with that, and then I was able to secure a third location. And yes, there has been plenty of times in the third location where shit has gone sideways. Now, with each iteration of the business, with each expansion of the business, my tolerance for stress grew. Had I not been exposed to the stress levels that I was prior to moving into our third location, it would have completely freaked me out, right? It would have been like, I always give the analogy where you have, if if you take someone from, if you have a freezing cold bucket of water and I have a roasting hot bucket of water, and I take my left hand out of the freezing cold and my right hand out of the roasting hot, and I put both of those hands into the bucket in the center, which is just room temperature water. One hand will feel freezing cold and the other hand will feel roasting hot. So the hand that was in the ice bucket will feel roasting hot, but the hand that was in the roasting hot water and put into the room temperature water will feel freezing cold, even though the temperature is the same. So basically, what that means is that your paradigm or your perception of what is going on is always based on what has happened previously. And so because I had those experiences previously into in the process of my expansion, well then I was able to deal with those things, which meant I just exposed myself to a greater and greater stimulus as my business grew. And so that was just with the gym, right? Then what basically happened was after a while, because at that point we were basically myself and my business partner PJ, we had been running a gym then for a few years, right? And so things kind of got easier. We started to work out different ways of marketing. We started to work out different ways of acquiring customers. Facebook ads had kind of become a thing, and we started to dabble in that a little bit, and we were having a lot of success. Like we were just running ads that were before and after photos, and people were filling in a woohoo form, and then we were selling them off the back of that. So it was so simple, and we started to make a bit of capital. Um, and then what happened was we started to see a little bit of abundance, but then it was like, okay, what is the next step? And for us, it was we wanted to move into education. We wanted to move into educating other fitness professionals as well. So then we opened the academy, which at the time was Elite, now known as ECA, the Education and Coaching Academy. And so that in itself, because we took on a franchise first and foremost, was another exposure to basically high levels of stress, right? Because it was a case where, you know, maybe there was that little bit of doubt where why should anyone listen to us? But, we're not stupid either. We were getting trainers coming to us for training anyway. So we knew that there was a bit of a demand there for what it was that we were doing, but we just didn't know to what extent it would be and if what we were bringing to the marketplace, which was a premium fitness education for newbie personal trainers, which wasn't available at the time in Belfast. No one was doing it, right? And so we wanted to bring that to the marketplace. We were the front runners there, still are. And, there was a lot of anxiousness around whether or not we were maybe charging too much, whether or not we had the right skill sets in terms of our marketing and everything else. And so it was a big, big challenge. But a few years down the line, with exposure to that, then that becomes easy. And the RPE decreases. And so then what happens is you get comfortable again, right? And then it's a case of, okay, well, what's next? And so for us, we then added on the ECA Summit, which was another big stress of the first time that we've done it. But now that we've done it three times, we kind of know all of the sort of ins and outs of what happens when you run events, how to book speakers, how to manage the day, crowd control, crowd communication, just different things that kind of go on when running events. And and then it was a case where we were like, right, okay, what's next? Now we're going to run this franchise. And 7 locations later, we're kind of getting a feel for all of the aspects of running a franchise. What goes on here, how to communicate with people in different locations in different countries, how to manage team members in different locations in different countries. And, total transparency, like this is hands down been the biggest challenge of my entrepreneurial career so far. One that is, it's been quite a few years in the making, and there's quite a few years left until I feel like it will reach its full potential. So we're still very much in the trenches with that business, figuring it out, um, trying to steady the ship. And we're, right now, and again, it's a case of the unknown unknowns. There's things that keep cropping up that we're having to deal with on a daily basis that we never would have known that would have been a thing, right? But again, it's a case where I know for a fact that given the challenge that's on the team right now, right across the board, I know that we will adapt and I know that we will improve and I know that we'll make improvements to the course and to the marketing and everything else. And that's just generally the way this goes. And I always have a thing that I say when, the proverbial shit hits the fan, hits the fan, is that it's just another one of those. It's just another one of those circumstances that seems to crop up every so often, right? So essentially, piecing this together, business is very much like periodization in the sense that you have to step cycle your way to new growth, right? And the other thing as well, what I mentioned earlier in terms of volume, intensity, density, and frequency, when when you are doing business, you can actually use those variables as well. So let's say in something like your marketing, right? Where is the volume variable in marketing? Well, it could be volume of content that you're putting out there. It could be volume of emails. It could be volume of direct messages, outbound, incoming. The intensity, there might be periods where you cool it down a little bit. So instead of pursuit marketing, maybe you move into more attraction marketing where you're just putting stuff out there and you're kind of attracting people into your world. And when you start to ramp up the intensity, then you're starting to pursue people and trying to pull them into your world, right? So that's slightly different. And that's how you might adjust your intensity as well. Uh, Density, I mean, the duration of content that you're putting out there, right? Long form, longer duration, short form, shorter duration. And you could manipulate that variable as well. Frequency in your marketing, like how often you show up. Maybe you write 2 emails a week and you want to increase it to 4. Or maybe you post once a day and instead now you're going to post twice a day or 3 times a day or whatever it is, right? So you can see how you would manipulate those variables in your marketing also, right? So the next sort of concept that I'd like to sort of bring to your attention and how I like periodization and business can be, it's that, if you can imagine, let's say you are running a training program, and I touched on this earlier in terms of specificity, right? And so imagine that you were running a program and all at once you were trying to, increase your squat, bench, and deadlift 1 rep max while at the same time training for a marathon, while also at the same time trying to train for high rocks and also at the same time trying to do jiu-jitsu, right? That's a lot of chaos going on. I'm sure you can agree. And so whenever you're doing business, that's exactly what it is like when you're trying to run multiple businesses all at once. Trust me on this. If anyone knows better, if anyone knows on this, it's me, right? I got 4 going on. Now, what I will say about my own personal businesses is that there's synergy between them all. The gym feeds the academy feeds the ECA Summit, and all of that feeds the franchise. Okay, so it's all one big gig. It's all under one umbrella. But what happens quite often is you might have someone who's running a gym and they decide to run an online business. Or maybe they're running a gym and they decide to open a cafe, right? Or, maybe they're running an online business and they decide to get into apparel or something along those lines, right? That's a lot of that's a lot of stuff going on that is quite frankly just unnecessary. Okay. So where attention goes, energy flows, and the man who chases 2 rabbits catches neither. So it's like saying to someone who's training for an Olympic event, do you know what? We're going to put you on this other program because just because we think it'll kind of work well for you. And it's nothing even remotely to do with the thing that you're trying to achieve. It's just so we can add it on here for variety's sake, and that wouldn't be a smart idea. So there has to be specificity in your program, and there has to be specificity in your business. Not only that, there has to be a defined outcome as well. So anytime I'm working with my business coaching clients, I have them work in macro cycle blocks, right? I have them working 12-week blocks quarterly, and we reverse engineer it from there, just like what I would do when I was programming for my clients. For example, I used to have my clients compete in the tactical strength challenge. And so what we would have done was that twice a year, um, at the end of quarter, no, it was after sort of every third in the year. Um, so there would have been one at like month 4, and then there would have been one at month 8 or 9, something along those lines, right? And uh, these were like worldwide competitions. And basically, what it was you got 3 attempts at a 1 rep max deadlift. Then you had 1 attempt at a max set of pull-ups, sometimes with weight, depending on the category that you were in. And then you had 5 minutes to do as many snatches as you can with a bell size that was relative to whatever bracket that you were in, right? So that was the tactical strength challenge, and it was developed by a guy named Pavel Satsulin, who is an OG when it comes to strength training and periodization. And I learned a lot off Pavel back in the day. But what would have happened was I would have programmed for my clients thinking about the end in mind. So we would have looked at where they wanted to finish on the TSC. Then I would have went 7 to 10 days prior, and I would have had them do 3 reps with 90 to 92% of what I would have wanted them to hit on the day of the competition. And then I would have known if they were ready. And also, I would have reverse engineered the program from that number. Okay. So business kind of looks the same. If you're looking to add 10 clients at the end of a quarter, well, then you have to backtrack from there. You have to ask yourself, well, how many sales calls or consultations do I need to have in order to get myself 10 clients? And you'll know that based on your previous work. And let's say your close rate on a call or a consultation is 50%. Well, then you need to book 20 calls within the quarter in order to get you 10 new clients, right? Then you go one step back again. You look at, well, how am I getting 20 calls? What sort of work did I do previously in order to get that? And maybe your optimal selling strategy is through Instagram, and it's through direct messages, and that's how you're acquiring customers. And maybe your show rate on calls is 50% again. And so what that means is you have to get 40 inbound direct messages, or maybe it's outbound. Maybe you're having to reach out to 40 people. Either way, you're going to have the conversation. It doesn't matter. But what I'm saying is, maybe you need 40 conversations in order to get 20 calls or consultations in order to get 10 people sold onto your program. So then you got to go one step back from those 40 DMs. What is required to get that? Maybe it is 200 outbound DMs, or maybe it is an ad running to a certain offer, or maybe it is a certain amount of posts, so you can pretty much guarantee that after every 3 to 5 posts with a call to action, you get so many inbound direct messages, right? um and so basically what precedes the action will determine the likelihood of the outcome actually happening, right? And again, you'll know this based on your previous work. So I say to people all the time on this as well is that music is the space between the notes, right? So then what you have to also look at, not just with your, your programming and periodization. So you've got your exercise selection and, you've got all of the variables that I mentioned before. But when it comes to business, then you kind of have to ask yourself, well, you know, what do I need to do in order to increase my close rate or in order to increase my show rate? So if you're getting 40 DMs and you're only getting 50% of those that are actually jumping on the calls, well, what's the space between the note? What has to happen in order to increase that number? Because if you're getting more calls, you're getting more sales, right? And then it's a case where you have to go, well, uh, if it's 50% close rate, well, then what do I need to do in order to increase that? Maybe you need to send out a video testimonial to each of your consultations before you're able to close the sale, right? Again, I'm just throwing some ideas out there and I'm just giving you my thought process when it comes to running a business and how I relate it closely to programming and periodization. Um, and it's very interconnected. Like it's extremely, they're extremely connected, and there's so many ways that you can segue between the two and how you can piece them together, right? You can then start to look at things annually and work back from there as well, which, by the way, is the smart way to be doing business, right? If you think about the people that are, the people that are most experienced and the wealthiest and the people who are the most affluent, they think over a longer time horizon. So they start to look at business annually instead of making decisions on a daily basis, because that's an emotional roller coaster. Like if you look at your any entrepreneurial career, it has never been a straight line to success. There's been days when it's been really up and down and all over the place. Again, we can relate that to programming and periodization, because no one just gets strong in a straight line. That just wouldn't happen. Your nervous system just detects so much threat if you try to get strong in a straight line. And so instead, what has to happen is you have to use step cycles or wave cycles. Sometimes you can use a linear training cycle, but it will only go so far until you reach a peak, and then it's up to you to either voluntarily step off the peak or you'll be forced off it either way, because the nervous system doesn't work in a linear fashion, right? You have to basically expose yourself to a certain stimulus, and then you back off, and then you decide to start climbing again. Same as if you were going to climb Mount Everest. You have to come down a couple of steps in order to acclimatize before you can start climbing up to new heights as well. So, all this to say is that I would suggest, here's a suggestion: start looking at business a lot like periodization, right? Again, assuming that you are in business, and look for ways that you can sort of connect the two, and also look for ways that, assuming you're listening to this because you want to grow in some way, shape, or form, be it in fitness, business, or just life in general, look for ways that you can apply step cycles to your growth, right? How can you expose yourself to just a little bit of poisonous exercise, as Pavel would have said back in the day? Expose yourself to a little bit of poisonous exercise so that adaptation can occur, so that you can then, become stronger, and everyone knows the drill whenever it comes to adaptation. So tissues break down, protein synthesis, adaptation, recovery, grows back stronger, right? And so that's essentially what we're looking to do with our programming and periodization, with our business, and even just with our life in general, right? What are ways that you can expose yourself to new challenges so that you can grow through the stress and pressure, and eventually adapt and come back stronger as a result of those new exposures. Hopefully that was valuable. This was just what was going through my mind today, and I thought that I would share. Once again, if you have listened this far, please do share the episode with a friend who you think would get value from it, and be sure to tune in for episode 12. See you on the other side.